just go ahead and start, and hopefully if the, more people are going to show up, they can filter in quietly. My name is Rebecca Keith, and I've been a Montessori educator since 1973. I got my primary training, my 3 to 6 training, from Ursula Thrush from 73 to 75, and then I also took my elementary training with her in 1991. So I've been teaching more of my life than I've been doing anything else, and it's something that I love very much. And so I'm really excited to be able to be here today and share some of what I've experienced over the years about Montessori. I'm assuming that most of you have some connection with Montessori, and that's why you're here. But oftentimes, we don't know as much as we think we know. So I thought I'd just go back to the very beginning and we talk a little bit about Maria Montessori, who she was, and how she came to the great work that she provided for all of us. And then talk a little bit about her perspective on the elementary age child, the child in what she calls the second plane of development. So anyway, Maria Montessori was born at the end of the 19th century, 1870. If you think back then historically, we're talking about a time in Italy when women were definitely second-class citizens. This was not a time when women were even allowed to go to the same schools as the boys went to. But Montessori was able, through her strength of will, to convince her dad, because it was her mom pretty much was going to let her do what she wanted to do if she could do it. But she had to convince her dad that she could go to the boys' school and learn mathematics. And she did. And then she went to the University of Rome. She was one of the very first women in Italy to become a physician. And so she came to the idea of education from a very scientific perspective. And she was also very pragmatic. So she was very interested in finding out what worked. And she found out what worked through observations, primarily observations of children. And so that's why we as Montessorians, more than anything, need to train ourselves to be good observers. So we can follow her example by following the child, because that was what she did. She didn't initially think she was going to be involved in education at all, but she was very curious about the process of learning. And again, if we think back to this time, this was a time when people were just first conceiving that people went through a developmental process to become who they were as adults. Up until then, people had pretty much looked at kids as kind of mini grown-ups, and they dressed them kind of like mini grown-ups, and they didn't really even have, in the schools for children at the time, they didn't even have child-sized furniture. So that was a big innovation that came with Montessori's work. In any case, she was so curious about the process of learning, and she got in sort of through the back door. She began by working with children that had disabilities. And there's one story that Margot Waltuck, who was one of her disciples, likes to tell us, that Montessori went to an asylum for the defectives, because that was what they called anybody that didn't fit in back in that day. They were all defective, and they would just kind of get sent away. And the gentleman who was running the asylum, she went in at lunchtime, the gentleman that was running the asylum said, just look at those children. They don't even know that this bread is for eating, because the children were there playing with the bread. And Montessori thought, isn't it amazing? These children need to play so badly. They need to manipulate things so badly that they will sublimate their need for food in order to play. So she had a very different perspective on the child. And she began to work with the children that had special needs, and she developed a whole series of materials for them. And these children, lo and behold, began to learn so well that Montessori thought, what if we had these kind of materials and a curriculum that was developmentally based for a broad spectrum of children? I wonder what would happen. And then in 1907, again, this was really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Italy, in the sense that people were coming in from the countrysides to work in the factories. And these were peasants who were illiterate. They had never learned to read, and they were living in projects that were built by the factory owners. And the kids were left, their mom and dad went to work at the factory, and the kids were left there on their own, and they decided that they needed somebody to supervise the children. Well, this was Montessori's chance. She had a whole classroom of children that she could watch. So instead of taking the great honor of being the physician who was worked in rich areas of Rome, she came to work in a slum called San Lorenzo and started her first school with these children of illiterate peasants who had come into the city. And it was through her experimentation with these children that she was able to develop her methodology for education. Initially, Montessori primarily worked with children between the ages of 3 and 6, and that's often what she's known for. And it really wasn't until she went to India, right before the beginning of World War II, that she really developed the philosophy that accompanied her education for the 6 to 12-year-olds, and where she really fleshed out her ideas about the developmental stages that children go through. Montessori talks about the developmental stages. She calls them planes of development. The first plane is from birth to 6, then 6 to 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 24. And there are many, many, many child psychologists and educational philosophers who talk about different planes and stages of development, but Montessori was one of the very first. And she felt that each child in each stage of development needed a kind of approach that was in tune with who these children were. So the kind of Montessori that people are mostly used to is that one that has been developed for the 3 to 6-year-old. The child at that stage is in a period that she called the absorbent mind, where they learn from interacting with the environment. The child from 6 to 12 has gone through a huge developmental change